Look, I didn't do anything wrong, just missed a date and had dinner with my boss. But then I came home to find legal papers waiting on the kitchen table. Now everyone thinks I betrayed him, and he's the one walking away with his dignity intact. I didn't think forgetting an anniversary was the end of the world. People forget birthdays, dinners, even weddings, and life goes on. That's what I told myself when I left the house that night, while my husband Caleb sat at home, waiting with some silly meal he had planned. He had mentioned all week about making something special, even took the day off from work, which in my mind was dramatic. Meanwhile, my boss Deacon had invited me to dinner downtown. Not just dinner, but an opportunity. He said we could talk about new roles, about how he saw potential in me beyond just being the reliable office manager. I couldn't just say no. What woman in my position would say no? Caleb texted me earlier in the day asking if I would be home by 6. I wrote back that work was running late. Not a lie, just a softer version of the truth. He didn't respond, which I figured meant he understood. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing my black dress, telling myself it was harmless. My sister Clara had once told me men don't even care about anniversaries. She said it was women who built them up and men who just went along. I repeated that thought in my head as I left the house, ignoring the flowers Caleb had set on the table near the door. They were lilies, my favorite, and instead of making me guilty, they just made me roll my eyes. He always did the sort of thing, like overcompensating for being so ordinary. The restaurant Deacon chose was one of those sleek places with glass walls and waiters who speak in low tones. He ordered wine before I even sat down. He told me I looked stunning, that my dedication was rare, that most women in the office would never stay as late as I did. I laughed and told him my husband was supportive of my career. Inside, I knew I was bending the truth. Caleb supported me, but always made those quiet comments about missing dinner together or asking why I needed to be available after hours. Deacon leaned in and said I had the drive of someone who could run her own team. I felt lightheaded, not just from the wine, but from the attention. While Caleb was probably plating some steak or pasta at home, I was sipping red wine under dim lights and being told I could be more. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a photo from Caleb. A candlelit dinner for 2, plates waiting, his message short. "Happy anniversary, Izzy." I didn't reply. Instead, I flipped the phone face down and told Deacon about a new system I wanted to implement at the office. He nodded like I was brilliant. When the bill came, Deacon slid his card over without even glancing. He said I deserved to be celebrated. Walking out of that restaurant, I told myself Caleb would understand if I explained later. After all, it was just a meal. He had the whole year with me. One night didn't erase that. But when I opened the front door past 10, the house felt strange, quiet, heavy. The smell of charred steak lingered in the air. The table was cleared except for 2 glasses of wine, one untouched. In the kitchen trash bin, I saw food scraped off plates, still warm. Caleb sat in the living room without the TV on. He didn't look at me. I said I was sorry work ran late. He said nothing. He just leaned back, his face unreadable. I added that Deacon insisted on discussing projects, and I couldn't leave early. Still silence. That infuriated me. I told him he was being childish, that anniversaries are symbolic but not essential. He finally asked why I hadn't even sent a text. I snapped that he should be grateful he has a wife who is ambitious, who's noticed by her superiors. I told him most women would kill for my position, and that he was being small-minded. He stood up and walked past me into the bedroom. No shouting, no scene. That was worse somehow. The next day his mother called. She said she heard I didn't show up for our anniversary dinner and asked if I was sick. I told her Caleb must have exaggerated, that we'd had a minor scheduling issue. She went quiet before saying Caleb deserved better. I laughed and said men don't even remember anniversaries unless someone reminds them. She hung up without another word. Clara texted me later, saying I was right to go out. She said, Caleb needs to grow up and stop making everything about his feelings. That made me feel vindicated. I told myself I wasn't cruel, I was practical. When I returned home that evening, Caleb had eaten leftovers alone. I tried to sit beside him and talk, but he only said he was tired. His silence was a wall, and I hated it. I told myself he was sulking like a child, and that eventually he'd snap out of it. But I could feel it even then. Something had shifted. The untouched glass of wine still sat on the counter, dust already settling on the rim, like a quiet reminder that he was waiting, and I never came. At work, everything felt easier than at home. Deacon greeted me in the mornings with a wide grin, asked how I was doing, and made me feel like my presence mattered. I soaked it up. Caleb, on the other hand, had barely spoken to me since that night. He moved around the house like a ghost, always polite but cold, and it irritated me more than if he had just shouted. I told myself he was sulking to punish me, but honestly, it just made him look weak. During lunch in the break room, one of my co-workers asked how my anniversary had gone. I laughed and said Caleb had tried to make a big deal about it, but I was too busy working late with Deacon. They laughed politely, and I added that Caleb could be dramatic sometimes, acting like dinner at home was more important than my career. Someone asked if he was upset, and I shrugged and said he should be proud his wife was impressing, the boss. The more I said it, the more it felt true. Later that week, Deacon invited me and a few colleagues for drinks. It was casual, but I could see how people watched the way he paid me more attention. When someone joked that Deacon clearly valued me more than anyone, I smiled and didn't deny it. I even said Caleb sometimes got jealous because I spent more time at the office than with him. The table chuckled, and I added that Caleb wasn't exactly the exciting type. I called him reliable, predictable, safe, words that sounded like compliments, but were daggers underneath. It felt good, honestly, to play the role of the ambitious woman with a boring husband at home. I knew Deacon liked it too. At home, things didn't improve. Caleb's mother, Marjorie, dropped by unannounced with some soup. She looked around the house and then at me, asking if I was too busy with the boss again. Her tone was sharp. I laughed and said Caleb's been oversharing and that she shouldn't believe everything she hears. I told her men exaggerate when they feel ignored, and she gave me this long look that made me feel judged. I went straight to my sister Clara afterward and vented. Clara said I was right, that Caleb was acting insecure, and that men who couldn't handle ambitious wives were stuck in the past. She told me to keep doing what I was doing, and I believed her because it was easier. But even Clara frowned a little when I told her about the dinner being thrown in the trash. At a family dinner the next weekend, the cracks widened. Caleb sat stiff at the table, barely eating. My father asked why he looked so tense. I laughed and said he was still upset about our anniversary, and that he wanted me chained to the stove instead of out building a career. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Clara nodded quickly, saying, "Exactly. Isolde deserves her own life." My mother frowned but stayed silent. Then Marjorie, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly said Caleb wasn't upset about food, but about respect, and that I had humiliated him. Everyone froze. I smiled sweetly and said she was overreacting, that Caleb was sensitive and needed to toughen up. I said it like a joke, but no one laughed. Caleb looked down at his plate, his shoulders heavy. The silence was suffocating. To break it, I added that Deacon appreciated me in ways Caleb never did, in how he listened to my ideas. That was when I saw Caleb's hand clench around his fork, and for the first time in a long while, he looked directly at me. There was no anger, just this blank emptiness, and it chilled me. Later that night, when guests had gone, he asked quietly why I had to mention Deacon in front of everyone. I told him I was just being honest, that people deserved to know he wasn't as exciting as I once thought. He didn't respond. He just went to the bedroom and closed the door. I felt both annoyed and triumphant. Annoyed because he wouldn't argue. Triumphant because I felt like I had proven my point. He couldn't even defend himself. The next day at work, I recounted the story to Deacon, making it sound like Caleb was overreacting. Deacon smirked and said some men couldn't handle strong women. His validation felt like oxygen. That evening, Caleb didn't join me for dinner. He ate alone in the kitchen, silent while I watched TV. I told him he was being childish, that he should get over himself. He finally asked if I was in love with Deacon. I laughed, told him not to be ridiculous, and said he was paranoid. He stared at me for a long time before walking away. That look, the same empty one from the dinner table, stuck in my mind even as I brushed it off. I told Clara about it later, and she said Caleb was just jealous, and that jealousy meant he cared. I clung to that explanation, but deep down, I wondered why his silence felt heavier than words, why it felt like something was cracking under the surface, something I didn't fully see. The cliffhanger came the following weekend when we were at another family dinner. I joked again about Caleb's moodiness, saying he was brooding like a teenager. But this time he didn't just sit there. He stood, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the house without a word. The sound of the door closing made the whole table go quiet. Everyone stared at me. Marjorie whispered, "You don't even realize what you're doing." And for the first time, I couldn't think of a single clever reply. The night Caleb walked out of that dinner, I told myself he was being dramatic. I laughed it off in front of everyone, said he just needed some air, but inside there was a twist in my stomach I didn't want to acknowledge. He came home late, long after Ella was in bed, and didn't say a word. He slept on the edge of the mattress like a stranger. In the morning, he left before I woke. That should have been my cue to soften, to bridge the gap, but instead I decided to double down. If he wanted distance, fine, I had Deacon. At the office, Deacon asked how things were at home. I sighed and said Caleb was sulking, that he couldn't handle the fact I was valued outside the house. Deacon chuckled, said some men preferred their wives small, contained, not shining. The way he said it made me feel vindicated. That week, I started staying later at work. At first, it was just an extra hour, then 2, until I was practically living in Deacon's office. He'd order takeout for us, and we'd laugh over wine while the building emptied. I told myself it was harmless. It wasn't like anything physical had happened yet, just dinners, conversations, a touch on the arm that lingered. But then one Friday, he asked if I wanted to continue our discussion, somewhere more private. I hesitated only for a second before nodding. His apartment was sleek, impersonal, nothing like my home. He poured drinks, told me I deserved to be appreciated. I told myself it was innocent, but I knew it wasn't. When I finally came home past midnight, Caleb was still awake, sitting in the living room with his laptop. He asked where I'd been. I said Deacon needed help finishing reports. He asked why I hadn't answered his texts. I snapped that my phone died. His eyes stayed on me for a long time before he just closed the laptop and went to bed. That silence was worse than shouting. The next morning, Ella wouldn't look at me. She sat at the table with her cereal, and when I tried to ruffle her hair, she leaned away. Caleb noticed but didn't say anything. He just kissed her forehead and left for work on a Saturday, which was unusual. Clara came over later, and I told her Caleb was being paranoid, that he even asked where I was last night like I was a teenager sneaking out. Clara rolled her eyes and said all men were controlling. She said I should be glad Deacon appreciated me. Her words soothed me, but only for a moment. That evening, Caleb came home with a quiet expression I couldn't read. He asked if I was happy. I said, of course, why wouldn't I be? He asked if I was being honest. I laughed, called him paranoid again, and told him he was making problems where none existed. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like filing something away. Days passed like that, with me floating on Deacon's attention and Caleb retreating further into himself. At work, Deacon started dropping hints about how much better I could do, about trips he wanted me to join him on. I didn't say yes or no, just smiled and let the flattery wash over me. At home, Caleb barely spoke. Dinner was quiet, Ella playing with her food, while Caleb asked her about school, and I scrolled my phone. I felt annoyed at the dullness of it all, especially after laughing with Deacon all day. One evening, Caleb asked if I could stay home instead of working late. I told him Deacon depended on me. He asked why Deacon needed me every night. I said it was called ambition, something he wouldn't understand. His face went blank again. That night, I went to Deacon's apartment without even pretending it was work-related. I told myself it was just dinner, but when I returned, Caleb was awake again, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of papers. He closed it quickly when I walked in. I asked what it was. He said work. I didn't believe him, but I pretended I did. The folder stayed on my mind. Later, when he went to shower, I peeked inside. Receipts, screenshots, notes. I shoved it closed before he came back, heart pounding. I realized then that he wasn't just sulking. He was watching, gathering. But instead of stopping, instead of pulling back, I told myself he was bluffing, that he wouldn't dare do anything drastic. He loved me too much. I used that thought to calm my nerves. But when I crawled into bed that night, he was already turned away from me, breathing steady like he had built a wall I couldn't climb. I closed my eyes and told myself he'd get over it, that he always did. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that folder sitting heavy on the table, waiting like a storm. The family gathering was supposed to be ordinary, just Sunday dinner at my parents' place, with everyone around the long oak table. But the tension came with us like a shadow. Caleb drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. Ella sat in the back, humming softly to herself, as if she was trying to fill the silence. I scrolled through my phone, texting Clara about a new dress I had ordered, pretending nothing was wrong. When we arrived, Marjorie was already there. She sat near my mother, her posture stiff, her lips pressed tight. I knew she was waiting to pounce, and part of me welcomed the fight. At least it would break Caleb's silent routine. Over dinner, conversation started light. My father asked Caleb about work. Caleb answered briefly, then fell quiet again. The silence irritated me, so I filled it with chatter about Deacon, about how he praised my efficiency, how he said I was the backbone of the office. Clara laughed and said Caleb should be proud to have such a competent wife. I smiled, feeling triumphant. But Marjorie's eyes narrowed, and she asked why I had to bring up Deacon in every conversation. I told her she was paranoid, that Deacon was simply my boss, and that it was natural for me to mention him. Caleb sat there, chewing slowly, not defending me or himself. I turned it into a joke, saying some people couldn't handle modern marriages where women worked late and had male colleagues. My father frowned, my mother looked down at her plate, and Ella pushed peas around with her fork. I kept talking because silence felt worse. Clara backed me up, saying men who couldn't handle ambitious wives were insecure. Marjorie snapped then. She said Caleb wasn't insecure, he was humiliated, and that I was the one dragging him through the mud. The room went cold. I laughed, too loud, and said, maybe Caleb should toughen up. Everyone stared at me, no one laughing. Caleb's face was unreadable, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. He set down his fork and looked at me, not with anger, but with something emptier, heavier. I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable, but I wouldn't back down. Instead, I said, people should be grateful I was noticed at work, because not every wife had that kind of recognition. Marjorie muttered that respect at home mattered more than flattery from strangers. I snapped that respect went both ways, and Caleb gave me none when he sulked like a child. Ella suddenly said she wanted to go home. Her small voice cut through the tension like a knife. My mother tried to distract her with dessert, but she shook her head, staring at her plate. Caleb stood then, his chair scraping loudly. He didn't say anything. He just walked out of the dining room, grabbed his coat and left the house. The slam of the door echoed in the hallway. Everyone turned to look at me. My father cleared his throat and asked what had just happened. I shrugged and said Caleb was overreacting, that he couldn't handle a strong woman. No one replied. Clara touched my arm under the table, whispering that I should just ignore him, that he would come back once he cooled off. But Marjorie leaned forward and said in a low voice, "You don't even realize what you've done." I smiled like it didn't matter, but inside my chest felt tight. I told myself Caleb was being theatrical, that he'd be back in an hour, that he always came back. But when we drove home later, the house was dark, his car was gone. On the kitchen counter, an envelope sat neatly, my name written in his clean, sharp handwriting. My hands trembled when I picked it up, though I told myself it was just some note, maybe an apology, maybe a plea. But the paper inside wasn't a letter. It was a copy of a legal consultation receipt with his signature at the bottom. My stomach dropped. I shoved it back in the envelope as Ella wandered in behind me, asking if Daddy was home yet. I told her he was just working late, my voice steady, though my heart pounded. She nodded, unconvinced, and went to her room. I sat at the table with that envelope, staring at it like it might burn through the wood. Caleb wasn't sulking anymore. He wasn't brooding in silence. He was preparing something, and I didn't know what. For the first time, I felt a sliver of fear cut through my certainty. The next morning, Caleb didn't come home. His car was parked at his office when I drove by on the way to work, which told me he hadn't even bothered sleeping in our bed. I told myself it was fine, that he'd come back when he realized how foolish he was being. At the office, I put on a bright smile, told Deacon everything was fine, but my hands shook when I typed. Deacon noticed and asked if Caleb was giving me trouble. I said Caleb was being insecure, that he was blowing things out of proportion, and Deacon just smirked and said some men aren't built for strong women. His calmness felt like a balm, so I let myself relax. But when I got home that evening, Caleb was waiting at the dining table. His suit was sharp, his tie neatly knotted, and in front of him sat a thick folder. He looked at me the way a stranger might, polite but detached. I asked if he was finally ready to talk. He said he had already done the talking where it mattered. He pushed the folder across the table. Inside were photographs. Me walking into Deacon's apartment. Me leaving late at night. Receipts for restaurants. Screenshots of messages I thought I had deleted. My stomach dropped. I demanded to know if he had followed me, spied on me. He said he hadn't needed to, that everything he had gathered was legal, clean, and ready for presentation. I tried to laugh it off, told him it didn't mean anything, that Deacon and I were just close colleagues. He said judges didn't usually buy those kinds of stories when there were time-stamped records and eyewitness accounts. His voice was steady, almost too steady, like he had rehearsed every word with a lawyer. I called him paranoid, told him he was ruining our family over nothing. He asked if Ella deserved to grow up thinking her mother's betrayal was normal. That word, betrayal, stung, and I snapped back that he was twisting things. He stayed calm, said he wasn't twisting anything, just protecting his daughter and his finances. He told me he had already spoken with an attorney and that papers would be drawn soon. I felt my throat close. I asked if he really wanted to drag his wife through court, if he wanted Ella to see us fight. He said Ella would see stability because he intended to have primary custody. I panicked then, accused him of trying to take my child away, but he just repeated that he wasn't taking her, he was shielding her. I shouted that Deacon meant nothing, that I still loved Caleb, that this was all being blown out of proportion. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked why love had to be proven in Deacon's apartment. I had no answer. He stood, said I should expect documents by the end of the week, and walked out with that same eerie calm. When Clara heard, she told me to hold my ground, to say Caleb was overreacting, that no court would side with him just because of dinners and texts. But when I showed her the photos he had gathered, her voice faltered. She said it looked bad, very bad. My parents were quieter. My father barely looked at me, and my mother just sighed and asked what had possessed me. Marjorie, though, was triumphant. She said Caleb was finally doing what needed to be done. Ella sensed everything. She clung to Caleb when he came to pick her up for school, barely hugging me. That night, I cried in my room, telling myself Caleb wouldn't go through with it, that he was bluffing. But the next morning, a courier arrived at the door with a sealed envelope. Inside were official documents: petition for divorce, request for custody arrangements, financial disclosures. My hands trembled as I read, each page filled with neat legal language that stripped away every excuse I had made. He had moved faster than I imagined, already protecting his accounts, already laying out a case that painted me as reckless, negligent, unfaithful. I wanted to scream, to call him cruel, but the evidence was right there in black and white. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the legal papers while Ella slept in her room. Caleb had been quiet for weeks, and I thought his silence meant weakness, but it had been planning. Every look, every unspoken word had been him building his case. I realized then that he wasn't going to shout, he wasn't going to beg, he wasn't going to crumble. He was going to erase me carefully, lawfully, piece by piece. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't shake the fear that he would succeed. The court hearing came faster than I thought it would. Caleb's lawyer filed, everything so quickly that I barely had time to find my own. Clara told me to get someone aggressive, but even my attorney seemed unimpressed when I tried to explain that it was just dinners and late nights, that Deacon didn't mean anything. She said the photos, the messages, the receipts all told a different story, and that the judge wouldn't care about my intentions when the evidence was so clear. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt like I was watching my own life through glass. Caleb sat straight in his suit, calm, collected, not even glancing at me. His lawyer spoke for him with precision, presenting the folder I had once seen on our kitchen table. Photos of me walking into Deacon's apartment at night. Screenshots of texts where I told Clara I was with Deacon again. Credit card statements with dinners charged late on work nights. Even security footage from the parking garage at work showing Deacon and me leaving together long after hours. I wanted to scream that it wasn't what it looked like, that it wasn't serious, but the judge didn't need explanations. He needed facts, and Caleb had them all. My lawyer tried to frame it as misunderstanding, said that nothing physical was proven, but even I could hear the weakness in her voice. Caleb's lawyer countered calmly, pointing out patterns, timelines, and how I had gaslit Caleb whenever he asked questions. That word again, gaslighting, he said it like a knife. My chest burned as I listened. The worst part wasn't the evidence, it was Caleb's composure. He didn't raise his voice, didn't glare at me, didn't show anger. He answered questions quietly, respectfully, explaining that his goal was stability for Ella, that he wanted his daughter to grow up in a secure home. When the judge asked him if he was seeking revenge, he shook his head and said simply, "I just want peace for my daughter." The courtroom was silent after that. I tried to look at Ella, sitting with Marjorie in the back, but she avoided my eyes. My little girl, who used to run into my arms after school, now clung to her grandmother, her face pale. My parents were there too. My father's jaw was tight, my mother's eyes full of disappointment. Clara sat beside me, glaring at Caleb like he was the villain, but I could feel everyone else's judgment pressing down on me. When it was my turn to speak, I said I loved my husband, that I never meant to hurt him, that Deacon was just a mentor. My voice trembled, and the words sounded thin even to me. The judge asked why, if it was so innocent, I had hidden it, lied about it, and mocked my husband publicly. I had no answer. I mumbled something about pressure, about needing recognition, but it sounded hollow. The decision came down in a blur. Temporary custody to Caleb. Financial protection for him. with restrictions on my access to certain accounts. The house would remain with him until further hearings. I felt the floor tilt beneath me as the words sank in. My lawyer whispered that I could appeal, but even she didn't sound confident. Caleb didn't gloat. He didn't even look satisfied. He just nodded, thanked the judge, and gathered his papers. When the session ended, he walked past me without a glance. Ella followed, holding his hand tightly. She didn't even say goodbye. Marjorie gave me a look that said everything she'd wanted to say for months. My parents approached briefly. My father muttered that he hoped I learned something from this. My mother touched my shoulder lightly but said nothing. Only Clara tried to console me, whispering that Caleb was being cruel, that men always got away with this kind of thing. But I knew that wasn't true. He hadn't been cruel. He had been methodical, lawful, deliberate. Back at the house that no longer felt like mine, I walked through the empty rooms. Caleb's things were gone. His clothes, his personal files, even the books he used to stack on the bedside table. Ella's toys were missing too. Her drawings had been removed from the fridge. The silence in the house was unbearable, louder than shouting. On the kitchen counter, another envelope waited. Inside was a list of dates and times for custody visits, all approved by the court. Each line was neat, clear, final. I sank into a chair and stared at it. All my excuses, all my laughter, all my gaslighting, none of it mattered now. Caleb had chosen not to fight with me in words. He had fought with proof, with patience, with law, and he had won. I tried to call him that night, no answer. I tried again the next morning, and the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message saying we could work it out, that I still loved him, that Ella needed both of us together. There was no reply. Days passed and nothing changed. When I saw Ella at the first custody exchange, she hid behind Caleb's leg, barely whispering hello. My heart cracked, but Caleb didn't comfort me or scold her. He just guided her gently into the car and drove away. I stood on the porch with my arms hanging useless at my sides, realizing the fight was over. Not just the legal battle, but everything. Caleb hadn't yelled, hadn't broken things, hadn't sought revenge and anger. He had dismantled my world piece by piece with evidence and silence. And now he was gone, with our daughter, with our home, with his dignity intact. I was left with nothing but my excuses echoing in an empty house. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.